The frenulum, the connective tissue between her upper lip and her gum, had a centimeter and a half laceration. She bit her tongue multiple times before she died. She fought back for her life as her father smothered her. Celeste had no such injuries. In fact, she had no external injuries at all. But according to the medical examiner, she was smothered nonetheless. The defendant then methodically and calmly loaded their bodies into his work truck.
The story most people remember begins with a calm-looking man standing on his driveway, speaking softly to reporters, asking for his family to come home. It looked ordinary, almost forgettable, and that's exactly why it worked. In August of 2018, Chris Watts appeared to be just another worried husband, another face in a neighborhood that seemed untouched by violence. But behind that carefully controlled exterior, there were already cracks forming, and one of the earliest places they appeared was not in an interrogation room, but on paper. Long before the full truth came out, Watts was writing letters. Not public statements, not confessions, private words meant for someone he believed represented a new beginning. Among them was a letter to Nicole Kessinger that many people didn't pay much attention to at first. It didn't sound dangerous, it didn't sound alarming, and that's what makes it unsettling in hindsight. Because sometimes, the most revealing documents aren't the ones where someone admits guilt, but the ones where they explain themselves without realizing what they're exposing. Letters have a way of slowing thoughts down. They remove the pressure of an audience and replace it with intention. Every word is chosen, every sentence is allowed to stay. And for investigators and behavioral analysts, that makes them valuable. They don't just show what someone wants to say, they show what someone avoids saying. As this case unfolded, that letter became less about romance and more about psychology. Less about love and more about separation. Not just from a marriage, but from responsibility itself. The public focused on the shocking outcome, but the warning signs were already there, quietly written in plain language. If you find yourself drawn into cases where the smallest details reveal the biggest truths, this is a good moment to like the video and subscribe to Real Case Records. Stories like this one don't rely on speculation. They rely on what was already there, waiting to be noticed. And as we move forward, keep one thing in mind. The most disturbing clues are often the ones that sound almost normal. When analysts later revisited the letter, one pattern stood out almost immediately. The way responsibility seemed to blur the moment it came close to the truth. Instead of clear, direct statements, the language drifted. Events happened, feelings surfaced, situations unfolded. The sentences moved forward without ever fully placing the weight of action on the person writing them. To an untrained eye, it can sound reflective or even remorseful. To investigators, it sounded familiar. In criminal psychology, this kind of wording is known as distancing language.
The defendant then methodically and calmly loaded their bodies into his work truck, not in a hasty or disorganized way. He was seen from the neighbor's doorbell camera, backing his truck into the driveway, going back and forth into the house, and back out to the truck 3 different times.
But agency was diluted. The result was a version of events that felt emotional while remaining incomplete. What made this especially telling was consistency. The same verbal patterns later appeared in interviews and interrogations, a habit of circling responsibility rather than confronting it. Analysts have noted that when someone truly accepts blame, their language becomes simpler and more direct. In this letter, complexity did the opposite. It created space between the writer and the damage left behind. The tone also worked in another way. By focusing on internal struggle, the letter subtly invited sympathy. It positioned the writer as someone overwhelmed rather than accountable, confused stepping away from responsibility, one sentence at a time. As the language of the letter was examined more closely, another absence became impossible to ignore. The emotional focus was almost entirely inward. The words lingered on personal stress, confusion, and longing, painting a picture of someone trapped in their own turmoil. What was missing were meaningful reflections on the people most affected by his choices. There was no sustained concern for the devastation unfolding beyond himself, only fleeting acknowledgments that never stayed long enough to matter. For investigators and behavioral experts, this imbalance was critical. In moments of genuine remorse, attention naturally shifts outward. The impact on others becomes central. In this letter, the emotional gravity pulled in the opposite direction. The narrative revolved around how he felt, what he feared losing, and what he believed he deserved after years of dissatisfaction. The victims existed only on the edges of the story, while a future imagined without them sat firmly at the center. This inward focus also revealed something else: psychological separation. Analysts have pointed out that long before physical actions occur, emotional detachment often comes first. The letter reflected a mind already stepping away, reframing relationships as obstacles instead of responsibilities. Love was no longer described as commitment, but as escape. That shift, subtle on the page, became glaring when viewed through the lens of what later came to light. During later interviews, this same self-centered framing resurfaced. Even when discussing irreversible outcomes, the conversation frequently returned to his own regret, his own loss, his own confusion. The letter was not an exception. It was an early version of a mindset that had already taken hold. If you're following how these patterns connect, go ahead and like the video. It helps keep deep dive case analysis like this visible, and it lets us continue unpacking the details that often go unnoticed. What makes this chapter of the story unsettling isn't what was said, but how naturally the silence fit. In that silence, priorities were revealed, and once seen clearly, they're difficult to look away from. As the investigation moved forward and recorded confessions entered the public record, the letter began to feel less like a private reflection and more like a controlled performance. When analysts compared its tone to later statements, the inconsistencies were hard to miss. The version of events suggested in the letter did not fully align with what was eventually admitted. Timelines shifted, emotions changed shape. Certain concerns appeared only when they served a purpose. This matters because consistency is one of the strongest indicators of truthfulness. When someone is being honest, their story may be incomplete, but its emotional core tends to stay the same. In this case, the letter projected confusion and emotional drift, while later accounts revealed deliberate decisions. The gap between those two versions wasn't dramatic, it was subtle, and that subtlety is exactly what makes it revealing. Behavioral experts often point out that letters written during critical moments are rarely neutral. They are crafted with an audience in mind. In this instance, the audience was someone whose perception mattered deeply. The letter worked to preserve an image, someone misunderstood, someone caught in circumstances, someone worthy of empathy rather than scrutiny. It wasn't meant to document reality. It was meant to shape it. When investigators re-examined the letter alongside interrogation footage, they noted familiar patterns. Avoidance of detail, emotional language replacing factual clarity, moments where the narrative softened just before reaching something concrete. Each instance on its own might seem insignificant. Together, they formed a pattern of narrative control. If you're appreciating how these layers are being peeled back, this is a good time to subscribe to Real Case Records. Every case has a surface story. We focus on what lies underneath. By the time the full truth emerged, the letter no longer stood as a mystery. It stood as a warning. Not because it predicted what would happen, but because it showed how carefully the story was being managed long before the final version was ever told. By the final reading, the letter revealed something deeper than contradiction or avoidance. It revealed intent through emotional influence. The language wasn't just soft or vague, it was reassuring. It offered comfort, validation, and a sense of exclusivity. Phrases frame the connection as rare, understanding, and safe, subtly placing the reader in a position of emotional importance. This wasn't accidental. It was persuasive. Behavioral analysts often describe this as emotional anchoring. By presenting himself as vulnerable and misunderstood, the writer created a bond that discouraged doubt. Sympathy became a shield. The more empathy the reader felt, the less likely they were to question what was missing. And what was missing, consistently, was accountability. The letter also leaned heavily into the idea of a future unburdened by the past. Not in explicit plans, but in tone. A forward pull that made everything behind him feel temporary, even disposable. Responsibility wasn't confronted, it was quietly replaced with possibility. In that framing, consequences fade, and desire takes center stage. What's striking is how effective this approach can be. On its own, the letter doesn't scream danger. It reads as emotional, conflicted, even sincere. But when placed alongside actions and outcomes, it becomes clear that sincerity and honesty are not the same thing. The letter didn't expose secrets, it exposed priorities. This is why documents like this matter in real case analysis. They don't tell us what happened, they tell us how someone wanted to be seen while it was happening. And often, that perspective explains more than any confession ever could. If this breakdown gave you a new way to look at real cases, consider sharing it with others who follow true crime responsibly. And if you haven't already, subscribing helps keep careful, fact-focused storytelling alive. In the end, the most unsettling truth wasn't hidden between the lines. It was written plainly, in what mattered, what didn't, and how easily one story was chosen over all the others left untold.